when they finish, they walk off, and it's kind of slowed down footage. That footage of Paul where he's sort of holding the violin bass up, he's holding it by the neck and he's holding it up upside down. They are all smiling their heads off. Mal is walking along behind them. He's smiling his head off. Everyone there is thinking, we have nailed this.
Yeah.
This is as good as it gets. It made me think about that thing about bands and their imperial phase, which, imperial phase is a phrase that was coined by Neil Tennant to describe the Pet Shop Boys in around 1988, that they'd always thought of as that time where it's sort of very broadly defined as the point at which you are both at your creative and commercial peak,
right.
and the two things coincide. And it struck me that they're absolute kings of the world at this point. And then in episode 6, you get the footage of them doing the orchestral recording session for A Day in the Life, which they've set up and invited lots and lots of guests. All the sort of, rock and arts luminaries from all across London have been invited to this thing. It's a happening. This is a recording session with an orchestra. You're not supposed to invite people to it. And all the orchestra players are all wearing sort of silly hats and things like that, and it just feels like a meeting of cultures in a way that probably no one had ever seen before. And throughout it, they're all sort of walking around talking and having a drink. And McCartney is strutting around in this incredible coat that, if I never saw him wear it ever again. If I had a coat like that, I would wear it every day. He looks amazing. And they are just absolute cock of the walk, all of them. They know how special this thing is they're sitting on. And there are people, I think I forget who it is, but there was a record producer who attended that session for A Day in the Life and had his head in his hands and said, how have they done this? I give up. I can't.
It's completely reframed his entire existence.
I can't make music anymore. What is this? This doesn't make any sense, And I think, and you can think of that, again, it goes back to the idea of, these being red and blue album periods, that essentially they kind of had two imperial phases and they're about just over a year and a half apart, that kind of thing. So you can, think of that Shea Stadium as the sort of peak of their touring years, and Sgt. Pepper, I think of A Day in the Life in particular as a real high point in their studio years, if you like, both in terms of the quality of the song, the fact that it is a Lennon and McCartney proper co-write in the most obvious sense, in which they've each written separate sections and stuck them together. Yeah. And also in terms of their work with George Martin, in terms of their innovation of just saying, okay, we have, was it 12 or 24 bars to fill, so we're just going to get Mal Evans to count down and then we'll fill it in later. Then they come up with the idea for this orchestra crescendo. Yeah. And it's just, the creativity of it is just staggering, And
it's really well presented here. We spend a lot of time on that song in particular. I think Imperial Phase is a really good way of putting it, because I think as many sort of Beatles fans and even outside of the Beatles fan community, people are prone to have that very sort of wearisome argument about which is the best album in the world or which is the best Beatles album. Using that phrase, Imperial Phase, is a good way of positioning why Sgt. Pepper is such an important release, like as opposed to which one's better. But it really is that cross section of creativity and commercial viability that makes that album so special. And obviously we covered all of this when we were talking about the album, when we discussed the Sgt. Pepper documentary. It was 50 years ago today. But I kind of like that. That's a good way of positioning it, I think, because then everything that comes afterwards doesn't necessarily have to be put in terms of its commercial propensity. It's more just about the creativity there. Yeah,
one of the other things about an Imperial Phase is that defines it is it tends to be the point in your career to which everything you subsequently do is later compared.
Right. Yes.
So you can see that with the Shea Stadium gig, just in the space of this episode, where a year later they're playing it in 1966. They haven't sold as many seats, and someone's saying to Meryl Streep, let's say it's Meryl Streep. Someone's saying to Meryl Streep...
If you're going to say it to anyone, it might as well be Meryl Streep,
no,
right?
That's true. Yeah. We'll get her on one day to confirm or deny it. But someone's saying to fans in the audience, oh, it's not as good as it was last year, is it? So already it's being compared. And, Sgt. Pepper is obviously the thing that... even now... personally, it's not my favourite Beatles album, but everyone always thinks of that as their sort of creative peak, and I think there's a good
Yes.
argument for saying it's their creative peak, if not my favourite of their albums. But that's what everyone compares everything they do